the US, regardless of who's been present, has always been our closest military ally, a strong supporter of the principles of freedom and democracy that we stand for. And I think that it reflects the fact that ultimately it is in the US national interest to stand strong in this situation. I'm sure they will be aware of the North Korean presence. The Pentagon will be more than aware of that. They'll be looking at that and realizing that we still need to send a really strong signal to all our potential adversaries, and for us in the US that includes Russia.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. Today we're at the International Armoured Vehicles event, its 25th anniversary event in Farnborough, and I'm delighted to be joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, James Cartlidge. James, welcome.
Good to see you.
Plenty to discuss. First of all, I wanted to get your reaction to the news we had yesterday, the Defence Secretary, your counterpart, John Healey, talking about this Russian spy vessel that was detected by a Royal Navy submarine. What is your reaction to that, first of all?
Well, obviously, when I replied to the statement, I think the key point I wanted to make, aside from the fact that we obviously totally back the government on standing up to the Russian threat, we agree with them, it is the primary, if you like, nation-to-nation military threat that we face, as evidenced by that sort of behaviour. What I emphasised then was I was pleased that the Secretary of State was being, frankly, more transparent about the threat, and I think we should be going further because the British people have got to understand the extent of the threat we face, and therefore why we will have to increase spending, which is something ultimately that comes from taxpayers and the people at home. So I think it's about being more open with the country without obviously sacrificing our operational sensitivities, and therefore showing the country, first of all, that we're going to stand up to this sort of behaviour, and secondly, that we're being open with the country about what that threat involves.
But isn't ultimately the reason Vladimir Putin feels emboldened to do this, and it's not just in British waters, we've seen it in the Baltic Sea as well, because ultimately he is still in Ukraine, and if he's defeated in Ukraine, then he won't feel so emboldened to retaliate against Ukraine's Western allies.
I am incredibly proud of the fact that we as a country, our MOD under our government, gave those weapons and other logistics to Ukraine. In fact, before the war started, it's Prime Minister Johnson and Ben Wallace, obviously. In many ways, something that I think other governments might not have considered. It took some guts. We gave it to them, helped them to withstand that initial column that invaded. And actually, if they'd fallen early, Ukraine, and Russia had conquered them, I think the world would be in a very, very dangerous place. As it is, we face a huge threat. But you're totally right. That's why we've stood by Ukraine. It's in our national interest, because if Russia had succeeded, it would threaten us. And you're absolutely right. We've got to keep supporting them, because if we hold Russia back by indirectly supporting Ukraine, we obviously don't fight there, but we provide logistics and so on. By doing that, it absolutely helps to keep us safer as a country.
What about those, and I know there'll be many people who watch Frontline who worry that Ukraine's allies in the West, they give Ukraine enough not to lose, they don't give Ukraine enough to win. Is that a concern of yours?
Well, I don't agree with that analysis. I've heard this point. We're only getting enough to be able to fight minimally. There's no conspiracy there. The reality is countries only have so much to give. That's the truth. All countries have a duty to their populations to defend them. So we've all had to make that difficult job of what do we keep back. As you know, for example, we gave them a lot of artillery, what we call the AS-90, which was the British standard artillery. We've now got to replace that. We've given them Storm Shadow, famously, and many other countries have given huge numbers of shells and munitions and so on, but all of those countries have to defend themselves as well, so it's a balancing act. So, I'm confident in terms of the UK, we've given as much as we possibly can. Of course, we've also helped to procure on the international market, and actually it's been an incredibly effective operation, but it's got to keep going, and we've got to keep going supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Do you think Keir Starmer waited too long to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory?
Well, we can all talk in hindsight. I became Shadow Defence Secretary immediately after the election, and this was something I urged the government to do. You'll recall Prime Minister Sunak took what was seen as a gamble at the time by allowing their use in Crimea. And that had an impact, but the Russians didn't escalate in the way they'd threatened. They made some incredibly bellicose threats, right? So I think it's the right thing to do, but there are many other facets of how we need to continue supporting Ukraine, and obviously all our allies need to keep doing their bit as well.
When you hear people talk about the threat of Russian escalation, How credible do you think that threat is? Because some people might say, well, look, Ukraine have proven now with the Kursk incursion, they have literally got Ukrainian troops in Russian territory, and Vladimir Putin has not reached for the nuclear button, which is everyone's worst case scenario. So are those fears valid?
It's a very good point. What we can say, and I said this in responding to Secretary of State yesterday, he used the phrase, I think it was, that Russia is dangerous but fundamentally weak. I think that was his phrase. And my view is, never underestimate them. A foe that is prepared to lose, 1,500 casualties a day, is an eye-watering number when you consider the sorts of losses we've had in recent conflicts. It's a staggering number, what they call the meat grinder. A foe who is prepared in their conventional deployment to absorb such losses, and when you consider what they have in stock that is not conventional and their fleet, which is still intact, of course, they remain a huge military threat in my view, and of course because of their disposition. What the real problem is, you've got Putin, you've got a dictator, you've got someone who is not restrained in the way we are in a democracy, who is not held to account. This is the fundamental problem. And so they understand strength. That's why we've got to support Ukraine.
Donald Trump is back in the White House. He's been very clear he wants other NATO countries to increase their defence budget. To what level do you think it is realistic for the UK to increase its defence spending to?
So we strongly welcome the fact that President Trump is pushing NATO countries to increase defence spending. We see it as all about sending that message to Putin. Look, NATO is strong and we're going to be stronger by spending more, and also doing things like, when I was Minister of Defence Procurement, joint procurement with other NATO nations. In terms of the UK, we'd already been increasing defence spending. It went from around 2 to 2.3 when Prime Minister Boris Johnson was in power. Chancellor was Rishi Sunak, and then at the election we wanted to go further again, increasing it to 2.5%. That was a very significant amount. But I said in an article about a week ago, I said, look, we are likely to have to go further. I wouldn't put an arbitrary figure on it. We will do our policy work as a party, and that will look at how much we need to spend, but importantly, what we need to spend it on. The final point I would say is, the reason we need to spend more is not with respect because of what President Trump says, it's because it's in our national interest too, because of the threat that we face. And I think that was highlighted by the Secretary of State speech yesterday.
I mean, President Trump has mentioned figures like 5% of GDP. Yeah. That seems very unrealistic, but 3%, could you see Britain getting there in the next few years?
Well, as I say, from my point of view, we went into the election with a fully funded plan to get to 2.5%. That is still a very significant increase. And just to explain why that matters, because I was Procurement Minister in the MOD, the real benefit of that plan was it gave certainty to the department over a multi-year period. If you are ordering, as we need to, missiles and munitions, which is not the only thing we need to order, but it's absolutely critical that we do, that we replace the munitions we're giving to Ukraine, that we order new technologies like anti-ballistic missile systems. For the department to do that effectively, it needs to know where it stands over a multi-year period. That's the really important point. As to the total quantum, well, our plan was to go up to 2.5%. It would have given a significant injection of money. But I've said, I said in this article I'm referring to, we may well need to go further, but that's something we will look at as part of our policy work. Before that, the government are going to publish their strategic defence review. I hope that's as soon as possible, because the real issue with them delaying 2.5%, whatever that number is, by delaying it, they've put it almost like a freeze on procurement in the MOD. It's very difficult in the MOD to procure years ahead when you don't know where you stand. So the most important thing is that we get on with increasing the quantum of cash so that we can start, replenishing our missile stocks and so on.
Donald Trump came out yesterday and threatened Vladimir Putin with new sanctions and tariffs and taxes on Russia if he doesn't end the war in Ukraine. Are you optimistic about what a Trump presidency will mean for the war?
Of course, I was very pleased that he made that point. I think that, the US, regardless of who's been president, has always been our closest military ally, a strong supporter of the principles of freedom and democracy that we stand for. And I think that, it reflects the fact that ultimately it is in the US national interest to stand strong in this situation. I'm sure they will be aware of the North Korean presence. The Pentagon will be more than aware of that. They'll be looking at that and realizing that, we still need to send a really strong signal to all our potential adversaries, and for us in the US, that includes Russia.
There are those, however, who are worried that in his desire to get a peace deal, he will ultimately sell out the Ukrainians and and you may see sovereign territory of Ukraine being ceded to Russia. Is that a concern that you share?
Well, I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen in the future. All I can go by is what President Trump has said so far. I thought it was very strong what he had to say. He was clear that Russia will have to respect the international rule of law that we all do, and I think that he will find, as we have, that it's in our interest as the UK and US to stand up to Russia, to stand alongside Ukraine. What signal would it send to other potential adversaries, other countries out there, China and so on, if Russia was to be seen to be prevail? I think it would be terribly damaging for the US. I'm sure President Trump realises that. And so, I was very heartened by what he said yesterday.
And just finally, one of the proposals that has come out of the Trump team in recent months is the idea of having a demilitarised zone, a DMZ, between Russia and Ukraine, a bit like you have between North and South Korea. If that were to happen, can you envisage any scenario in which British troops help police that?
Well, again, with respect, you can appreciate I'm not going to get drawn into speculating on the future. I know there has been some discussion at this point. We had the Prime Minister talking about potentially, having soldiers training out there. I think we're some way off that. All we know for certain is that Ukraine is fighting today, they are fighting tonight against Russia. Russia has got this support from North Korea. It remains a formidable foe. We must keep supporting Ukraine with everything we've got, and all our allies doing the same. I think that remains, dare I say it, the position, and for as long as it takes.
James Cartlidge, Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.